So, as we continue our series on how not to do church, this week we're looking at our freedom and rights. And so I guess this message could be how not to use our freedom. And so this week we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And we're going to read this short chapter together. Now, about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. But the man who loves God is known by God. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods, in inverted commas, and many lords, in inverted commas, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. But not everyone knows this. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us nearer to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone with a weak conscience sees you who have this knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't he be emboldened to eat what has been sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother, for whom Christ died, is destroyed by your knowledge. When you sin against your brothers in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause him to fall. You may say, how does this passage on sacrificing meat to idols apply to us today? And it's a valid question. Yet, it probably applies more than we would think on face value. But first, let's look at what it meant for the Corinthian believer. Why was this even an issue for them? Well, just like in some of the sacrifices that were done in the Jewish temple, meat offered to idols in pagan temples was usually divided into three portions. One was burnt and sacrificed to the idol. Another portion was given back to the person who was offering the sacrifice for him to take home and eat with his family. And the last portion was given to the priest. But because the priest was performing sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice, he might not want every portion that was allocated to him. Remember, they didn't have deep freezers in those days. And so he would sell his portion of meat at the temple restaurant or meat market. So the question the Corinthians were asking was simple. Could they eat meat purchased at a temple meat market? Why would they even want to do that? Well, the meat served or sold in the temple was often cheaper. And what is Paul's answer to this question? First, he makes it clear that idols are nothing at all. They're not real. Zeus is no more real than Gandalf or Wonder Woman or Inspector Gadget. So believers who worship the only one true God that we've just been singing to know that in the final analysis, food sacrificed to idols is sacrificing to nothing at all. It's just food. And so if you're mature enough to see and understand this, and your conscience isn't affected by eating meat that comes from an idol temple, Paul says it's no issue. The same might occur for us with food designated as halal. Halal food is where food somewhere in the Muslim food chain, a person has invoked the name of Allah over that food in the same way that we would probably say grace. But according to Paul, because Allah is not the one true God, halal food is just food. Essentially, it's devoted to nothing. However, in the Corinthian church, there were two groups of people. Remember, we've spoken about the factions. And there were two groups of people. Those who felt it was a sin to eat food sacrificed to idols, and those who felt that it wasn't a sin. The idea being that if these gods aren't real to begin with, then what harm can they do? But Paul says, just because idols are powerless does not mean that they're not dangerous. If an idol can diminish our faith, then it needs to be taken seriously. So, a young man, let's call him Sipho, recently comes to faith in Jesus. And his family are still deeply involved in African traditional religion and sacrificing to ancestors. And so he is still deeply sensitive to anything related to that. So one Sunday after church, he and a group of his friends go off to a coffee shop to meet, and one of them has some sage that they put, a sprig of sage that they put over the candle on the table and let it burn to create an aroma that smells very nice while they start praying. But for Sipho, his senses go into overdrive because burning sage was deeply tied to ancestor worship. The friend who burnt the sage meant no harm, but Sipho left feeling confused and spiritually unsettled. That's one scenario. We could have similar scenarios in all kinds of situations. What we learn from this is exactly what Paul was communicating to the Corinthians. That freedom without sensitivity can do more damage than good. What's meant for one person and is meat for that person might be poison for another. And so Paul says, using our liberty in a way that creates a stumbling block for others is never good. So how do we not do church? Number one, never flex your freedom without considering others. We're not supposed to treat our Christian liberty like a badge that makes us somehow more superior. For the Christians, Eating meat sacrificed to idols while ignoring how it wounded the consciences of other believers was not a good idea. All it does is create a culture of arrogance instead of grace, where the strong flaunt their rights and the weak feel alienated. Biblical love is more important than knowledge. James 3:17-18 says, "But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all correct, accurate, and without error." No, doesn't say that. It says the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure. In other words, without bias. Then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. When I see some of the things, and I'm not talking about the non-Christian world, I'm talking about the Christian world, when I see some of the things that are posted on social media today from Christians, it breaks my heart. And we know and are known by God when we model His love. 1 John 4:7-8 says, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God. Whoever does not love does not know God." This isn't a side issue. Whoever does not love does not know God. Because God is love. This is, as you can tell, this is deeply challenging to me. And while I was preparing this, there were one particularly decision that I had made in my mind because I was right. And as a pastor, I needed to share what was right. And I had to change my tack completely because it wasn't loving. We don't get to flex our freedom if we know it's going to hurt another Christian brother or sister. Secondly, never ignore the fragile conscience of a fellow believer. We can never just expect everyone just to grow up and get over their convictions. Mocking and dismissing those who still wrestle with issues that aren't even an issue for you and me is never helpful. And in my experience, I've found that there are very few people who are strong in everything. Often people who are mature and strong in one area will be weak in another. And so don't be surprised if at some point you find fingers pointing back at you. So even if our motive is good, what ends up happening is instead of raising the spiritual temperature and growth and maturity in the church, we damage it and potentially derail a brother or sister's walk with Christ in the name of liberty. Thirdly, never prioritize being right over being loving. We were never meant to elevate theological precision above relational sensitivity. And that's hard for me to even say because I'm a pastor. I'm meant to diligently search the scriptures so that I can lead accurately and well as a pastor in a church. But if I'm going to use my accuracy in a way that causes division in the church, is that loving? What benefit is it to fracture the body of Christ because I forget that love is a higher ethic than freedom in the kingdom? Christian freedom is not a license for us to bulldoze others. If our rights cause harm, they're no longer right. The mature believer should ask, not what am I allowed to do, but what builds up the body? Because it's possible to be fully right in our convictions, but completely wrong in our attitudes if we're not coming from a place of love. So how do we apply our freedom then? Firstly, we need to teach freedom with humility. This means when we preach or teach on matters of Christian liberty that touch subjects such as alcohol or entertainment or cultural practices or things like that, we need to emphasize that freedom is a gift that we steward, not a weapon that we wield. When we steward our freedom, it prevents us from becoming spiritual bullies. So instead of coming down like a ton of bricks on people, we stay respectful, honoring, inquisitive. Yes, you may have the freedom to do this, but is it loving? Is it helpful? Does it build others up? Love and humility build up. Knowledge puffs up, even if it's good knowledge. And so Paul directs mature believers to not be the cause of someone else's stumbling or pushing them to do something that goes against their conscience. That's why Paul says in verse 13, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall. Some of you may know that my son went through a bout of addiction. And so when my son visits us, I will very, very rarely drink alcohol in his presence. And he's told me, Dad, you don't need to do that. Do what you want to do. I just can't. I just want to be sensitive. I don't want to use my freedom in a way that would harm him. Secondly, we need to create space for conscience and conviction. Sometimes in the church, and I think we do this is completely unintentional, but we create an environment where everyone feels they need to do and say what they believe they're expected to do and say. And the problem with this is that it creates followers who don't necessarily follow out of conviction. They follow because, oh, that's what I'm meant to do. And so we call that compliance. And when people are compliant, they're no longer thinking. They just follow what everyone else is doing. And that produces very weak faith. But when people are given the space to have honest conversations and think about what they believe, and we're not trying to produce cookie cookie-cutter Christians. It also gives space for them to form their own personal convictions rather than just comply. And this helps newer or more cautious believers feel safe. It makes them feel heard. So we need to create space in our communities and space in our church where we can normalize conversations and debate, and where it's okay to say, I'm not comfortable, I'm still working through that. Thirdly, we need a disciple with both truth and tenderness. When we're trying to help someone grow in theological understanding, it's so important to pair truth with patience. Because knowledge without love leads to pride, and love without truth leads to compromise. As believers, we're called to love and help one another. Particularly when they're struggling. Not cast stones. The woman who was almost stoned to death for adultery is a perfect example. The Pharisees weren't wrong by saying that what she was doing was sinful. They were right. But their hearts and lack of compassion was completely sinful. And I have to say that I pray God will guard our hearts from some of what I see coming out of American Christianity that gets off on shaming others and causing, it's almost done for entertainment to make the other side go back with their tail between their legs. If you genuinely care for someone and you believe that they're sinning, the worst thing you can do is confront them with arrogance. Jesus calls us to deal with issues. He's not saying laissez-faire, do as you please. We need to deal with issues, but we need to do so in love, just as he did. What a concept. Fourthly, we need to celebrate unity over uniformity. It's so important to remember that we're all really different. And when we come together as a body of believers from different backgrounds, different situations, different convictions, etc., and we come together to worship, that's extraordinarily unique and special. We have no idea of the miracle that God is doing in his body when that happens. Because it shows that the gospel is bigger than our preferences and what we see as our right. And it's when we listen to each other's testimonies and share our meals together and exist within multi-generational and multicultural ministry moments that we reflect the beautiful diversity of the body of Christ at its best. Wow. When Paul says he would rather not eat meat again if it prevented someone else from stumbling, that's not weakness. That's God-shaped love. So how does this apply to us? It applies every time we think that we are right about something. Every time we think we're right about something, We've even got chapter and verse for why it's right. And it causes us to judge a brother or sister who thinks differently to us. And it's not so much the judging, because we're called to test the spirits. We're called to look for fruit. So it's far more to do with our attitude than our judging or our discernment. It's when our judging makes us feel better than that we need to be careful. And when we want to impose our right to do and say something. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is, if I say what I want to say or do what I want to do, will it build up the body or damage the body? That's it. So whether the issue has to do with the music we listen to, or the entertainment we enjoy, or the alcohol I drink, or the places I go, the key is, will I acknowledge that the unity of the body is more important than what I want? And will I submit my right to be right because I value the unity of the body more? For anyone who's gone to Lebanon on a missions trip, you will know that the women have to dress in a certain way. And for us guys, we can't wear shorts. Not in public. So particularly when we went on our first trip, which was in August, we were sweltering in the heat, in our long pants. But we did it for the sake of the gospel and the fact that we didn't want to be a stumbling block to the spiritual growth of other believers around us, particularly those who were hosting us, to be like embarrassed. I'm actually not really with them. We didn't want to cause shame or hardship for them in a community where that is really seen as a no-no. Our right or knowledge doesn't supersede our obligation to love. So what this doesn't mean is that the church then essentially operates according to the least mature person in it. That's not what this is saying. But what it does do is it flies against the cancel culture alive and well in the world that writes people off, and instead it embarks on a discipleship that is marked by patience and love. That's the spirit of 1 Corinthians 8. True maturity isn't about exercising our rights. It's about laying them down in love if necessary. The strongest believer isn't the one who knows the most, but the one who loves the best.